A popular claim floating around the internet is that King Leopold II, between the years 1885 and 1908, when he ruled the area of the modern Democratic Republic of the Congo, killed 10 million people. This area was known as the Congo Free State, and in 1908 the Belgian government finally took over the area. This number is based on claims in a book by Adam Hochschild, who is the co-founder of the publication Mother Jones. He was also an activist for civil rights and was for ending apartheid in South Africa, directly leading to the current situation in South Africa. There's lots of people talking about South Africa because of Trump's statements, pointing out how the narrative painting South African whites as invaders or exploiters is completely bogus, but false history about Europeans in Africa goes much further than that. So let's delve into the Congo genocide myth. Hochschild makes two key claims in his book. 1. Roughly 10 million people were killed by agents of the state in Leopold's Congo. 2. Roughly half the population of Leopold's Congo were killed. Now, the first thing to consider when looking at this is this possible? Well, I see three things that need to be established for these claims to even be possible, let alone proven. 1. The population of the Congo at the time. 2. The extent of Leopold's rule within the Congo. And 3. Enough people in the Congo to do this killing. Now, we do have several general population estimates for the whole of Africa. The one I am using here is from GeoHive, which puts the population of Africa at 111 million in 1850 and 133 million in 1900. This gives us a population of 126.4 million in 1885 based on a linear trend, which means a population density of 10.83 per square mile. If this population density is just mapped onto the Congo, this would yield a population of the Congo of 9.8 million. One might presume that Congo's population density would be less than this, given how much of the Congo is jungle compared to other parts of Africa, but let's just be generous and map the general population of the whole of Africa onto the Congo. For the year 1900, we can infer the population of Black Africa by subtracting both the population and landmass of North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, from Africa, and mapping the population density of the remaining population of all of Africa onto the Congo. And when we do that, we get a slightly higher estimate of 10.726 million. The overall estimate for the population of Black Africa here is a holistic estimate. It includes countries that didn't have population records from governments by 1900. If we limit our analysis to African countries that had population records in 1850 and map the population densities of those countries onto the Congo, we get a lower number of 8.542 million. Intuitively, it would seem that areas of Africa that had enough of a bureaucracy to conduct a census would have higher population densities than those regions that did not have the necessary bureaucracy to conduct a census. And so this number, 8.542 million, would intuitively seem to be an overestimate of the population of the Congo, since we're taking areas that had governments capable of conducting a census. So I believe this is actually a very generous assumption in terms of the population of the Congo. But never mind, we're still way under the 20 million needed for Hochschild's statements to be correct. Patrick Manning, by collating previous estimates and looking at records of slave sales, made estimates of various regions of Africa. One of the regions he calculates the population estimate for is a region he calls Luango. The region appears to include not only the modern-day Congo, but also the Republic of Congo, part of Cameroon, and all of Uganda. Patrick Manning's estimates of Luango population go from 7.487 million in 1850 to 10.555 million in 1950, and calculated from a linear trend between those 2 years, we would get 8.561 million in 1885. Given that this region is larger than the area ruled by the Congo Free State, Manning's estimate for the population within the Congo Free State would probably be around 7 million. The most interesting estimate I found came from a paper entitled A 100-Year Database for Integrated Environmental Assessment by Kellen Golwick and J.J. Batts. It estimates how much land in an area used for agriculture based on changes in the ecosystem today. And using this ecological analysis, they have some back estimates for the populations of various countries. Now, the Goldwick-Bax results are, on average, 98.2% the size of the results from Wikipedia, and they are, on median, 91.5% the size of the populations of Wikipedia. So Goldwick-Bax runs a little bit smaller than Wikipedia for population estimates. And so to harmonize Goldwick-Bax Congo result with the Wikipedia result, we can divide the Congo number by the average ratio and the median ratio. In addition, just to get an idea of the maximum discrepancy, we can see that Goldwick-Bax number for Nigeria is only 0.27 of the wiki number. And if the Goldwick-Bax Congo number was divided by this would give an estimated population of the Congo of 15.196 million in 1900. Now, we don't know if Goldwick-Bax is an error or if the government records are an error for Nigeria in 1900, or maybe it's a mixture of both. And so this is about as high as I think you can go in estimating the population of the Congo at that time. Whatever you think of the Goldwick-Bax numbers, it is important to note that they estimated an increase in the population in the Congo from 1890 to 1910 based on the ecological changes, i.e. based on the increase in farming. Now, by their method of estimating past population, they may very well be massively undercounting the Congo, because the number we get from Goldwick-Bax is 4.1 million. Maybe the jungle climate erases past evidence of agriculture more than other climates do. Or maybe food was imported into the Congo, and the Congo was not self-sufficient on food. These are all things that could bias the results. But what's interesting is that Goldwick-Bax still showed growth in the Congo population for the period of the Congo Free State when this genocide was going on, when supposedly half of the population of the Congo was being executed. From 1890 to 1910, 3.3 million to 5.1 million. So even if Goldwick-Bax numbers systematically underestimate the population of the Congo, which I could see reasons why they would be, it's also possible that they get it exactly right, they still show a trend of population growth, which is evidence that the Congo's population was growing under Leopold's rule, which would be hard to do if Leopold killed 10 million people in that period. And so if there was a massive genocide, well, it appears to have been lower than the natural population growth rate, a lot lower. The population growth rate of the Congo from 1950 to 2016 has been around 2.8%. This results in a doubling roughly every 27 years. Goldwick-Bax estimate for year-on-year growth between 1890 and 1910 averages to 2.3%. In my opinion, the Congo probably had a lower population density relative to its neighbors in 1900 than it does today, due to the jungle being easier to control with technology, i.e. in addition to industrial farming methods that flatter African countries get, the Congo would also get jungle removal, meaning that the relative population of the Congo today compared to the rest of Africa is probably higher than it was in the past, when the jungle climate was more of an impediment to population than it is today. If someone was given an assignment to estimate the population of the Congo Free State in 1900, and they didn't go in thinking that 10 million were killed by Leopold, and thus didn't have any preconceptions as to what the population had to have been for that to be possible, they wouldn't come anywhere near 20 million people in the Congo. They would come to a mid-range estimate of around 7 million, with the highest plausible number being around 10.7 million, with an absolute maximum of 15.2 million, a low estimate of around 4 million, and an absolute minimum estimate of about 3.1 million. You're just not getting the numbers to get to that 10 million number that Hochschild throws around. The next problem with the 10 million claim is that the Congo Free State did not control all of the Congo. Here's a map showing effective control over the region prior to the war against Tipu-Tip. This map shows the de facto kingdoms controlling regions of the Congo, with the area inside the dotted lines being nominally under control of the Congo Free State, though not necessarily functionally under control of the Congo Free State. According to the Belgian embassy in London, quote, "Finally, the cultivation of rubber was geographically restricted to the equatorial rainforest around the northern Congo basin and to a lesser extent to the Kasai region, totaling 1/5 of the Congo's territory. The estimated 10 million deaths for the whole of Congo cannot be ascribed to the Belgians simply because at the beginning of the colonization, they were not even present or active in the whole of the Congo." Close quote. This also calls into question the claim that the agents of the Congo Free State managed to kill half of the population of the Congo, whatever that population was, since it's not known whether the Congo Free State even had access to half of the population. Throughout its rule, the organization that was tasked with enforcing the rubber quotas, established during Leopold's rule and was accused of mass murder, was the Force Publique. I could not find annual records of the size of the Force Publique, but I did find numbers for specific years, and those numbers are presented here. The numbers for the year 1892 are known because that was during the war with Tipu Tip, ruler of a slave kingdom in Zanzibar and claimant of the Eastern Congo, and that was the reported strength of the Force Publique. We also know that the tour of duty in the Force Publique was 7 years, and Leopold ruled the Congo for 23 years. This means that Leopold presided over 3.826 tours of duty for the hypothetical soldier that joined at the very beginning of Leopold's rule. Now, of course, some men will re-enlist. Some men will die before the tour finished. Some men will quit after a single tour. And since we don't know which of these effects are bigger, the assumption that minimizes maximum error would just be to assume that on average each soldier served 7 years. If we average the size of the Force Publique in 1892 and 1908, we get 15,450 men in the Force Publique at any one time. And with 3.286 tours of duty, this means that there were roughly 50,769 men in the Force Publique during the entirety of Leopold's rule. This would translate to roughly 197 men killed for each member of the Force Publique in order to reach 10 million kills. This seems like an extremely dubious figure. In light of the extreme implausibility of 10 million people being killed in Leopold's Congo, one may be tempted to simply move the goalposts to a lower kill count, to say 1 million. I'm not here to say that the Force Publique didn't kill anyone, but the reality is that there is no more direct evidence to base an estimate of 1 million than there is 10 million. The only difference is that 1 million people were killed is not obviously impossible based on what we know about the population of the Congo. The fact that the political activist, and I believe it is fair to call Hochschild a political activist, spat out 10 million reveals the unseriousness of his work. If you recognize that the 10 million number is obviously bogus, why would you depend on the authority of a guy who said 10 million were killed to then just turn around and say, oh, maybe it was just 1 million? Because while killing 1 million was possible, the fact that the first charge against the Congo Free State of 10 million was impossible shows that this whole thing was kind of a scam from the start. A politically motivated witch hunt of King Leopold himself, who had several enemies back in Belgium. One issue historians face when condemning Leopold II is a lack of documentation. Even a BBC documentary blithely accused Leopold of destroying the relevant records that would prove his guilt. This is not a charge that is easy to respond to. How does one prove that no records were destroyed? Do you just come up and say, oh, here's the records that weren't destroyed? As you can see, there are none of them. So when someone accuses you of destroying evidence that would prove your guilt, how can you possibly defend yourself by such a charge? But it shouldn't matter, because from 1904 to 1908, in response to the public outcry over the Congo in Europe, an independent council created by Italy, Switzerland, and Belgium conducted an ongoing investigation and released periodical reports called the Official Bulletin of the Congo Free State. I want to add an addendum here that the Belgian parliament was not necessarily on Leopold's side. See, Leopold's holdings in the Congo were his own and was somewhat independent of the state of Belgium itself. And Belgians in parliament generally wanted to make the Congo a holding of Belgium, not King Leopold's personal holding. And so their bias, if anything, would be to make Leopold II look bad and to play up any atrocities so as to justify taking the Congo from Leopold and give it to themselves, which they eventually did in 1908. Of course, this council did not report extreme genocide going on at the behest of Leopold's government. In fact, they reported that the abuses occurred almost exclusively when forced public detachments were sent out without a European commander, and that the presence of European commanders was what prevented atrocities and rape. It is interesting to read these bulletins and see just how matter-of-fact they are about this. They just assumed that blacks will kill and rape unless kept in order by whites. That was the thinking of the time. And in terms of mutilation, chopping off hands and feet, there is zero documentation, as these bulletins state, that that was Leopold's policy, nor did the investigation find any evidence that it was Leopold's policy. In fact, the investigation claimed that this was done by indigenous members of the force publique, particularly when a European officer was absent from the patrol. In addition, chopping off limbs seems to be a ridiculous policy given that the biggest problem Leopold had was a labor shortage. It is also known that limb mutilation had occurred both before and after the Congo Free State. And without any reliable statistics, there's no way to know if it even increased during the Congo Free State. We don't know if the rate of limb mutilation in the Congo Free State was any higher than it is today, or prior to Leopold's rule. The argument of the investigation was that Leopold's government was not proactive enough in stopping these atrocities and may have facilitated them by arming members of certain tribes who had long-running hatreds against other tribes. There are two more important facts to consider. The first is that there were roughly 200 Europeans in the Congo Free State administration at any one time versus around 13,000 black force publique troops at any one time, averaging more around 15,000. And so all of the mutilating, the raping, and the killing that was done had to have been done overwhelmingly by the black force publique troops. Second, there were no orders or policy to mutilate, rape, or kill without cause any of the Congolese. There may have been execution orders, but there were no mutilation or rape orders, just as there are execution orders in countries today. And while there may have been some white people who engaged in these acts, I certainly cannot say for certain that I know there were not. It was almost certainly lower on a per capita basis. But even if all 200 of the whites were vicious killers and sadists who traveled to the Congo because they know they could get away with it there, there's only so much 200 men could have done. Now, at the time, the Belgians blamed Leopold for what the black force publique troops were doing because they viewed blacks as half devil, half child, and whites were responsible for their action in the same way a dog owner is responsible for a dog's action. Sure, the blacks did the killing, but they're your responsibility. If you don't keep them in line, then the blacks are going to do what the blacks are just going to do. So modern day white liberals would be aghast at such thinking, but it creates a problem for intellectual consistency. They're condemning Leopold for a standard that treats blacks as pets from whom the owner is to be in charge and responsible for. That was the standard by which Leopold was accused of genocide in a transitive way. Now, in reality, none of these people have thought this through. Most of the people pushing the Leopold Congo genocide line probably don't even know that there were only 200 whites there at any one time. They just hear the meme, they get kind of a vague impression, and they just believe it, and aren't aware that blaming Whitey for whatever happened, which itself is a matter of debate, depends on treating blacks like pets. Between 1892 and 1894, the Congo Free State was at war with Tipu Tip and had begun advancing westward, using an incident at a fort which Tip's forces attacked and defeated a force publique garrison due to a dispute over a slave girl. And so if a dishonest or ignorant newspaper editor got some pictures or description of a battle in that war, he would have plenty of gory pictures and gruesome details. And then he could say, "This is Leopold's Congo," to dishonestly seed the idea that this was normal Congo Free State policy for all the Congolese. Look at all these dead bodies on a battlefield. Oh, we won't call it a battlefield, we'll call it a killing field. This is Leopold's Congo. In addition, if say some men in the force publique chopped off the hands of 20 people, well, 20 images can fill up an entire page, and it would make it look like mutilation is happening all the time in Leopold's Congo. and then they could turn around to the public and say, "This is Leopold's Congo." You could then show the horrible hospitals that are dirty and lacking supplies without the context that this was actually an improvement over the folk medicine of the Congolese. People not aware of the context that as bad as things might be in the Congo, they're better than they were prior. But just images of horrible hospital conditions, for example, or just reports of horrible hospital conditions by Western standards, without the context that this is an improvement, and then just say, "This is Leopold's Congo." Leopold's Congo did not have any form of population statistics, and so there is no record of how many people died or even could have died in the Congo at this time. This makes it easy for people to pull numbers out of there. Moreover, it is the Congo. It is a place where people die all the time for horrible reasons and live in conditions that Europeans even then would consider torture. 200 Belgian administrators are not going to change that. In addition, some journalists can come in and take pictures of people with their hands cut off and say, "Look, this is going on in Leopold's Congo," and the reader is then able to fill in the gaps with his mind. The rubber quota people talk about so much was just a form of taxation. In fact, throughout history, labor rendered to the state was the most common way in which taxes were paid, since most people didn't have currency. And since most people in the Congo didn't have currency, that is how most of the Congolese paid their taxes. And Leopold's policy was that no man's tax share should be over 40 hours per month. In terms of cutting off limbs, that was a practice that predates and postdates Leopold's Congo. In addition, several of the photos of Africans with limbs chopped off have Europeans posing with them. Do you imagine that they would pose with them if they had done it themselves? Do you think they would want to take photos because they were proud of doing that themselves? And activists looking for a flashy number will say 10 million and quickly cobble together imagery, anecdotes, personal accounts without doing the first level of research and ask, is this even possible? Or try to figure out if indicators of past population even showed a decline or an increase in population over the period of Leopold's rule, when they clearly showed an increase. A similar thing happened in Britain during the Industrial Revolution, as politicians learned of the frightful conditions of factories, ignorant of the fact that it was similar to the frightful conditions of peasant life, and in many cases represented an improvement. And I believe Europeans living in Belgium were unaccustomed to how the rest of the world was most of the time, especially very primitive societies that tend to have a much higher proportion of their population die violently. Thanks for watching. I'm getting back to the regular program. For those thinking about the previous video, consider it had to be this way and one must learn to read the stitches on a fastball. If you enjoy these kinds of videos, please consider donating to the Patreon Cool Tapes. Cool Tapes is a cool guy who may or may not just so happen to post a cool picture every time I post a video on this channel. There seems to be a correlation, but that cannot be confirmed. You can also send money to a person via Zelle, email address in the description. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your continued support.